On April 18, 2011, a horrific act of violence led to the brutal murder of 15-year-old Seth Jackson in Summerfield, Florida. Seth's life was violently cut short after he was lured to a house under false pretenses by his peer, Michael Bargo, and 4 other individuals. Michael Bargo, who was 19 at the time, along with his girlfriend Amber Wright and their accomplices, had planned the murder in advance. Seth, who had no idea what awaited him, was invited to the home of Charlie Ely, where he was to be beaten and tortured before being killed. Once at the house, Seth was subjected to physical abuse, and then Bargo shot him multiple times. After Seth was killed, Bargo and his co-conspirators disposed of his body by burning it in a fire pit. The remains were then placed in buckets and discarded in a nearby quarry, an attempt to erase any trace of the crime. After the murder, the group of perpetrators initially tried to cover up their crime, but the evidence and the confession of one of the accomplices led to the arrest of Michael Bargo and his friends. In 2013, Bargo was convicted of first-degree murder, and the jury sentenced him to death. However, his journey through the justice system would not be as straightforward as it seemed. In 2016, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that juries must unanimously recommend the death penalty in death penalty cases. This ruling came after the conviction of Michael Bargo, who had been sentenced to death based on a 10-2 jury recommendation. As a result, Bargo's case was sent for resentencing. The resentencing took place in April 2023, and a new jury unanimously recommended the death penalty for Bargo's role in the cold and calculated murder of Seth Jackson. Bargo's defense team presented arguments focusing on his troubled upbringing, pointing to family issues and mental health concerns as mitigating factors. They asked the jury to recommend a life sentence without the possibility of parole instead of death. However, the prosecution made it clear that Bargo's crime was heinous and premeditated, describing his actions as cold and calculated. The prosecution's case highlighted the brutality of the murder and the callousness with which Bargo and his accomplices disposed of Seth's body. On April 6, 2023, a judge officially handed down the death sentence to Michael Bargo, reaffirming the decision made in the resentencing trial. The sentence was a stark reminder of the severity of the crime and the enduring impact on the victim's family and the community. Bargo's co-defendants were all convicted and sentenced to life in prison.
One of the most haunting and long-awaited moments in the history of racial justice came to a head when James Ford Seal, a former Ku Klux Klan member, was finally convicted for a crime he had committed nearly 4 decades earlier. The crime in question, the 1967 abduction and brutal murder of 2 African-American teenagers, Charles Moore and Henry D., in Mississippi. Seal, alongside his Klan accomplices, was part of a campaign of terror aimed at suppressing civil rights efforts in the South. On that fateful night, Moore and D. were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. Their bodies were thrown into the Mississippi River, and for over 40 years their deaths remained an unsolved mystery. This crime was one of many violent acts committed by the Klan during the turbulent 1960s, yet Seal's role remained hidden, the truth buried in decades of racial violence. It wasn't until the 2000s that Seal was finally caught, as the case was revisited by law enforcement. In 2007, after years of mounting evidence, Seal was arrested and charged for his involvement in the deaths of Moore and D. During his trial, Seal showed no signs of remorse. He steadfastly denied his involvement, maintaining a position of defiance and victimhood. He claimed that the prosecution was politically motivated and that he was being wrongfully accused due to his affiliation with the Ku Klux Klan. Despite his claims, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Key witnesses, some of whom had lived in fear of retaliation for decades, stepped forward to testify against Seal. The most chilling part of the trial was the revelation of the horrific nature of the crime. Seal and his accomplices had tortured Moore and D. before murdering them, a brutal act that highlighted the true extent of Klan violence during the civil rights movement. Seal's reaction to his life sentence was one of arrogance, defiance, and complete denial. He had lived most of his life free from the consequences of his actions, and even as the truth came to light, he showed no remorse for the pain and suffering he had caused. He had been a member of an organization that thrived on hate and terror, and his lack of regret only deepened the sense of injustice that had plagued the case for decades. His conviction was a bittersweet victory for the families of Moore and D., who had fought for justice for so many years. The trial was a reminder of the long-lasting scars left by the Klan's reign of terror, but it also served as a testament to the resilience of those seeking justice.
At just 16 years old, Centoya Brown found herself at the center of one of the most controversial murder cases of the 2000s. On August 7, 2004, she shot and killed 43-year-old Johnny Allen, a man she had met earlier that evening. Allen had picked her up while she was walking along the street in Nashville, Tennessee. What followed was a deadly encounter that led Centoya to claim it was self-defense. She said that Allen, after taking her to his house, tried to assault her, and in the heat of fear and panic, she shot him in the back of the head. But the courts saw things differently. Despite Centoya's claim that she was defending herself from sexual assault, the prosecution argued that it was a premeditated murder, not an act of self-defense. The decision to sentence her to life in prison was a harsh reality for a 16-year-old girl already struggling with years of trauma and abuse. Centoya wasn't a cold-blooded killer. She was a victim herself, raised in a broken home and subjected to years of sexual abuse. But despite that, the courts saw her as a criminal. The conflict here is sharp. How do you reconcile the actions of a girl who committed murder in a moment of fear with the fact that her life had been marked by a history of violence and manipulation? Can you justify a life sentence for someone who had never been given a chance at a normal life? Imagine this: a 16-year-old girl sitting in the courtroom as a judge delivers a life sentence. The room is heavy with the weight of the decision, and Centoya is sitting there, expressionless. As the judge read the sentence, the eyes of the nation were on her. Some saw her as the victim of a broken system. Others saw her as a danger to society. Her lawyer, in his defense, argued that Centoya had been mentally and emotionally disturbed due to her history of abuse. But the jury was not convinced. The media portrayed Centoya as someone who, despite the abuse she'd suffered, had taken a man's life and was now paying the price for it.
On January 12, 1995, 18-year-old Christa Pike committed one of the most chilling murders in Tennessee's history. A troubled teen with a history of aggression and instability was a student at the Tennessee Technical Institute when she lured 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer into a secluded area on the campus grounds. The two had been acquaintances, but it was clear that Pike's intentions were far more sinister. The crime occurred after an argument between Pike and her boyfriend, 16-year-old Toby Lowry, who was with her at the time. Pike, with a growing sense of jealousy and rage, led Colleen to a remote location under the pretense of a peaceful conversation. Once there, Pike and Lowry attacked Colleen, brutally stabbing her multiple times. The violence was shocking. Pike was later described as having taunted the victim as she died. She used a large knife to stab Colleen in the chest. Pike then watched as Colleen slowly bled to death. Pike and Lowry, after committing the murder, attempted to cover up their crime by setting Colleen's body on fire to destroy the evidence. The severity of the attack and the trail of blood led investigators to the scene, and soon Pike was arrested. The details of the crime were gruesome, and the brutality shocked the public. Christa Pike's trial began in 1996, and the prosecution painted a chilling picture of a young woman capable of extreme violence. Pike, who had shown little remorse for the murder, testified that she had committed the crime out of sheer hatred and that Colleen was just a victim of her rage. Despite her age and troubled background, Pike was convicted of first-degree murder. The jury deliberated and sentenced her to death, making her the youngest woman in the United States to be sentenced to death at that time. Her sentence was upheld in 1997, and she was placed on death row at the Tennessee State Penitentiary. Over the years, Pike's defense team filed several appeals, arguing that she had been influenced by mental health issues, including depression and borderline personality disorder, and that her young age at the time of the crime should have been a mitigating factor. Her legal team also argued that she had been subjected to severe abuse during her childhood, which they believed contributed to her violent behavior. In 2001, Pike's case was taken to the U.S. Supreme Court, where her defense team sought to have her death sentence commuted, citing that the sentence was unconstitutional for someone so young. Despite these efforts, the court upheld her sentence, and Christa Pike remained on death row for several more years. Then, in 2012, a monumental change occurred. Following the Supreme Court's ruling that declared it unconstitutional to sentence juveniles to death for non-homicide crimes, Pike's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. The court ruled that her age, her mental health struggles, and the brutal nature of her crime all factored into the decision to reduce her sentence. In 2013, Christa Pike's appeal for parole was denied, and her sentence to life in prison without the possibility of parole stands. In 2014, nearly 20 years after her conviction, Christa Pike's case reached its final chapter when she was granted a last meal before her scheduled execution. She requested a modest meal, a seafood platter, and an orange soda, an odd choice for someone about to face the electric chair. However, on the day of her execution, the state's prison system once again suspended her execution.
In 2005, the nation was finally forced to confront the painful truths of the Mississippi burning case, when Edgar Ray Killen, a former Klan leader, was convicted for his role in the 1964 murders of 3 civil rights workers: James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. These young men had come to Mississippi to help register black voters, but instead, they became victims of a brutal and senseless act of racial hatred, their deaths symbolizing the extreme violence that marked the civil rights movement in the South. The crime occurred on June 21, 1964, when Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner were abducted by a group of Klan members. The men were held captive, brutally beaten, and then shot to death. Their bodies were hidden in a dam, and the search for them lasted for weeks, capturing the attention of the nation. The case became emblematic of the dangerous and violent opposition that civil rights activists faced in the Deep South. However, despite the shocking nature of the crime, justice was not swift. Killen, who was a prominent member of the Klan, was never charged for the murders at the time. Instead, the investigation stalled and the case remained cold for decades. The Klan had long enjoyed a form of immunity, often protected by a web of silence and complicity within the local community. For years, those responsible for the murders walked free. But in the late 1990s, as the country began to re-examine its history and old wounds were reopened, the case was brought back into the spotlight. In 2005, over 40 years after the murders, Edgar Ray Killen was finally arrested and charged with the manslaughter of the 3 men. His trial was a dramatic moment in the pursuit of justice, as it marked a rare conviction for a Klan member involved in such a heinous crime. Killen's reaction to his conviction was one of defiance and indignation. Throughout the trial, he maintained his innocence, claiming that he had no involvement in the deaths of Chaney, Goodman, and Schwerner. He dismissed the charges as politically motivated, suggesting that the government was trying to make an example of him. In court, Killen presented himself as a victim, claiming that he was merely a man of faith and leadership in his community, and that the real criminals were the federal authorities for seeking justice after so many years. Despite his defiance, the evidence against Killen was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses came forward to testify about his role in orchestrating the abduction and murder of the civil rights workers. The prosecution presented a chilling account of how Killen, with others, had planned the murder, and how his leadership in the Klan had led to the targeting of the 3 men. Killen's sentencing was a moment of reckoning for the families of the victims, who had waited over 4 decades for justice. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison, a far cry from the death penalty that was initially considered for his crimes. His life sentence was a bittersweet victory for those who had long fought for accountability. But Killen's complete lack of remorse for his actions left a lasting scar on the memory of the victims and the families they left behind.
Alyssa Bamante lured 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten into the woods behind her home in Missouri before strangling her, stabbing her, and burying her body in a shallow grave. Alyssa then went on to calmly report her victim missing, playing the role of a concerned neighborhood girl. However, it didn't take long before she was caught, and the brutal truth emerged. In her journal, Alyssa had written about the thrill she anticipated from killing someone, describing the murder as like a dream. How does a 15-year-old girl, seemingly just another face in the crowd, suddenly become a killer? The mystery behind Alyssa's actions isn't just the act itself, it's the chilling lack of remorse. What was going through her mind when she took the life of a 9-year-old child? Could this be a case of a troubled teen spiraling out of control? Or was Alyssa, as she later claimed, just curious about what it would feel like to kill? As the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the fate of a young girl rested in the hands of a jury. Alyssa sat in the defendant's chair, her face blank, her demeanor calm, and her heart seemingly detached from the horrors of what she had done. When the details of the murder were read aloud, her expression never changed. Some say she was emotionless, others claim she was numb, but the most unsettling part of the trial was how little she seemed to care. When Alyssa took the stand, her testimony was chilling. She spoke of how she wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. It wasn't the remorse you'd expect from a 15-year-old girl who had just taken the life of another. Alyssa's defense argued that she had been suffering from mental health issues, including depression and an apparent history of self-harm. However, as the evidence unfolded, it became clear that Alyssa had been planning the murder for months, even going as far as to write about it in her journal beforehand. Alyssa was convicted of second-degree murder and armed criminal action in 2009, and she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole.
On the evening of March 2nd, 2008, a tragic and senseless act of violence claimed the life of 17-year-old Jamiel Shaw II. Shaw, a promising high school student and talented athlete at Los Angeles High School, was returning home from a trip to the Beverly Center in Los Angeles when he encountered Pedro Espinoza, a 19-year-old gang member who had just been released from jail. What followed was a confrontation that would forever alter the course of Shaw's life and the lives of his family members. Jamiel Shaw II, known as Jazz by his friends and family, was in his final year of high school, where he excelled in football and was being scouted by colleges such as Rutgers University and Stanford University. That evening, Shaw was walking home from a bus stop, only 3 blocks away from his house, when he received a phone call from his father, Jamiel Shaw Sr. They briefly spoke about Shaw's location, and his father was expecting him home soon. It was then that Shaw was confronted by Espinoza and another individual, both of whom were members of the 18th Street Gang. As Shaw walked down the street, the two men jumped out of a white car and confronted him, asking, "What gang do you belong to?" When Shaw did not respond quickly enough, Espinoza pulled out a firearm and shot Shaw. The bullet struck Shaw in the stomach, causing him to fall to the ground. As he tried to shield himself with his hands, Espinoza fired a second shot, hitting Shaw through his hands and into his face. The shots were fatal. Jamiel Shaw Sr., who heard the gunshots from inside his home, rushed outside and found his son lying on the ground, still alive but gravely wounded. He stayed with his son until emergency medical personnel arrived, but it was too late. Shaw was transported to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 9:55 p.m. that evening. Pedro Espinoza, who had been living in the U.S. illegally, was arrested shortly after the shooting. Espinoza had a criminal history, having been arrested previously on charges related to assault and gun possession. Just a day before Shaw's murder, Espinoza had been released from jail on a 4-month early release after serving time for assaulting a police officer. Espinoza was formally charged with first-degree murder, and his trial began in 2012. During the proceedings, the prosecution presented a damning case, showing that Espinoza had not only murdered Shaw, but had done so with cold intent. Espinoza showed no remorse for the murder, and his lack of empathy during the trial only added to the gravity of his crime. On May 9, 2012, after a lengthy trial, the jury convicted Pedro Espinoza of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death on May 23, 2012. The jury's decision reflected the severity of the crime and the chilling nature of the murder. At the time of sentencing, Pedro Espinoza was asked if he had anything to say. His response, however, was devoid of emotion or remorse. He offered no apology to the Shaw family, nor did he express any understanding of the devastation his actions had caused.
On May 26, 2017, a tragic and racially charged incident unfolded aboard a Max Light rail train in Portland, Oregon, resulting in 2 deaths and 1 serious injury. The perpetrator, Jeremy Joseph Christian, a self-identified white nationalist, launched a violent attack after passengers intervened to stop his racist tirade against 2 teenage girls, one of whom was wearing a hijab. This case highlights the dangers of unchecked hate speech and the profound impact of bystander intervention. At approximately 12:30 p.m. on May 26, 2017, Christian boarded a crowded MAX train and began shouting racist and anti-Muslim slurs at two teenage girls, one of whom was wearing a hijab. Witnesses reported that Christian's outbursts included demands for the girls to go back to Saudi Arabia and other derogatory remarks. In response, three men, Ricky John Best, a 53-year-old U.S. Army veteran, Taliesin Miadin Namkaimech, a 23-year-old recent college graduate, and Micah David Cole Fletcher, a 21-year-old student and poet, attempted to de-escalate the situation by intervening. Despite their efforts, Christian drew a knife and fatally stabbed Best and Namkaimech, while Fletcher sustained serious injuries. The attack occurred rapidly, within a span of approximately 11 seconds. Following the stabbings, Christian fled the scene but was apprehended shortly thereafter by police. Christian was charged with multiple offenses, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and several counts of assault and intimidation. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence of Christian's history of racist and extremist views, including online posts and participation in far-right rallies. The defense attempted to argue that Christian acted in self-defense, citing his perception of being threatened by the victims. On February 21, 2020, after deliberating for 2 days, the jury found Christian guilty on all counts. In June 2020, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 310 months for related charges. The Portland community responded to the tragedy with an outpouring of support for the victims' families and a renewed commitment to combating hate and intolerance. A mural was painted at the Hollywood Northeast 42nd Avenue Transit Center, near where the attack occurred, to honor the victims and promote messages of unity and peace. The incident also sparked national discussions about the rise of hate speech and white nationalism, as well as the role of bystanders in preventing such attacks. The bravery of Best, Namkaimech, and Fletcher in standing up against hate serves as a poignant reminder of the power of individual action in the face of injustice.
Dakota White was involved in the brutal murder of his father during a violent outburst. The attack occurred in the family's home in 2019, a night that began like any other. The details of the crime are chilling. In the midst of a heated argument with his father, Dakota grabbed a weapon and attacked, leaving his father dead in his own home. The severity of the attack and the fact that Dakota had been under the same roof as the man he killed made the crime all the more heartbreaking. After the incident, Dakota showed no signs of immediate remorse or regret. It wasn't until the reality of what he had done fully sank in that the shock set in. His family, already fractured by years of turmoil, was left reeling from the devastating impact of the murder. At just 16, Dakota White was a young man on the edge, struggling with his mental health and an upbringing marked by emotional instability. But what makes this case even more tragic is that Dakota wasn't a typical criminal. He was a child, a son, who had been raised in a home filled with tension and unresolved conflict. The courtroom was heavy with tension as Dakota sat in front of the judge, waiting for his fate to be decided. When the details of the crime were revealed, it was clear that this wasn't a simple act of violence. It was a culmination of years of emotional turmoil. Dakota's defense team argued that his mental health had played a significant role in his actions, suggesting that he had been dealing with anger and depression for years. Experts testified that he had not only struggled with anger issues, but had also been raised in an environment that lacked emotional support, which may have triggered the outburst that ultimately led to his father's death. Dakota's reaction during the trial was haunting. When he was given the opportunity to speak, he expressed remorse, almost too calmly. "I didn't want this. I didn't mean to hurt him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Was this an attempt at atonement, or was it the hollow words of someone too far gone, still lost in his emotional turmoil? Dakota White's sentencing was inevitable. He was convicted of second-degree murder, but the true horror of this case wasn't just the crime. It was the fact that this was a boy, not a man.
On December 28, 2017, Marlon Joseph, then 29 years old, committed a horrific double murder in West Palm Beach, Florida. The victims, 36-year-old Calladea Crowell and her 11-year-old daughter Kira Callis Inglet, were tragically shot in a crime that sent shockwaves through the community. The incident occurred in the home that Crowell and her daughter shared with Joseph, who was living there with his mother and other family members. According to investigators, the shooting stemmed from a dispute between Joseph and Crowell's daughter, who were close in age. Joseph, enraged by the altercation, escalated the situation into a violent and deadly confrontation. Joseph began the attack by shooting Khalida Crowell in the head, ending her life in a brutal manner. But the horror didn't end there. After killing Khalida, Joseph chased her daughter Kira outside and shot the young girl 5 times. After the murders, Joseph fled the scene in Khalida Crowell's car, leaving the victims' bodies behind. Detectives were able to quickly piece together the events leading up to the killings, and Joseph was arrested shortly thereafter. In February 2020, Joseph was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional gun charges. The trial was emotionally charged, with the families of the victims offering statements that underscored the profound grief caused by the loss of Khalida and Kira. During the proceedings, family members described how their lives had been torn apart by the brutal murders, and how the loss of an innocent child and a mother left a permanent scar on the family. On April 9, 2021, Judge Cheryl Caracuzzo sentenced Marlon Joseph to death. The sentence marked the first death penalty in Palm Beach County since 2002. The depth of Kyra's suffering was a focal point of the case, and it left a lasting impact on those in the courtroom. As the sentence was read, family members of the victims, many of whom were in tears, expressed their mixed emotions. While they were grateful for the conviction, they understood that no sentence could bring back the lives that had been taken.
On March 15, 2019, Brenton Tarant, an Australian white supremacist, carried out a devastating terrorist attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. Armed with semi-automatic rifles, he opened fire during Friday prayers at the Al Noor Mosque and the Linwood Islamic Center, resulting in 51 fatalities and 40 injuries. This act of violence marked the deadliest mass shooting in New Zealand's history and one of the most severe shootings by a single gunman globally. Tarant, aged 28 at the time, meticulously planned the attacks over several months. He conducted reconnaissance missions, including flying a drone over the Al Noor Mosque to study its layout. His manifesto, titled The Great Replacement, espoused white nationalist and anti-immigrant ideologies, drawing inspiration from previous far-right terrorists. Tarant's actions were driven by a belief in the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which posits that white populations are being replaced by non-white immigrants. On the day of the attack, Tarant live-streamed the shootings on Facebook using a head-mounted camera, marking the first successful live-streamed far-right terror attack. The footage depicted a first-person perspective as he entered the mosques and opened fire on worshippers. The livestream was widely condemned for its graphic content and the perpetrator's attempt to gain notoriety. Tarant initially pleaded not guilty to 51 counts of murder, 40 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of engaging in a terrorist act. However, in March 2020, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges. In August 2020, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the first such sentence in New Zealand's history. Justice Cameron Mander described Tarant's crimes as so wicked that even if you are detained until you die, it will not exhaust the requirements of punishment and denunciation.
Jonathan Belton, just 15 years old, was involved in a brutal crime that left a community in shock. In 2015, Jonathan, along with his accomplice, tried to rob a man in a neighborhood in Florida. During the robbery, things escalated quickly. The man fought back, and in the ensuing struggle, Jonathan pulled out a gun and shot him, killing him instantly. At such a young age, Jonathan was thrust into a situation that led to death, a decision that would define his future forever. After the crime, Jonathan didn't immediately flee. Instead, he and his accomplice tried to cover up their tracks, but it didn't take long for the police to catch on, and they were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. As Jonathan sat in the courtroom, facing charges of first-degree murder, he appeared to be a different person. Gone was the defiant teenager that many expected. Instead, there was a scared child, someone who seemed lost, confused, and out of place in a courtroom filled with seasoned lawyers, jurors, and a judge who had seen it all before. When Jonathan was given the chance to speak, his voice trembled as he offered an apology to the victim's family. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm sorry," he said. His words, though simple, were hollow in the room that was so filled with loss and grief.
I know what really happened. The Lord know what really happened. I love you all to death.
Jonathan was handed a life sentence for his crime, but as the sentence was read, something unexpected happened. Jonathan didn't break down. He didn't collapse in his chair or beg for mercy. Instead, he sat silently, staring at the floor, as if the reality of the situation had finally begun to sink in.
On January 28, 2014, 18-year-old Austin Meyers, a high school student from Clayton, Ohio, took part in one of the most brutal murders in the state's recent history. Meyers, along with his accomplice, Timothy Mosley, concocted a plan to rob their childhood friend, 18-year-old Justin Back. The plan was simple: steal a safe from Justin's home, which they believed contained a substantial amount of money. However, what started as a robbery quickly escalated into a horrifying act of violence. Austin Meyers and Timothy Mosley, both 19 at the time, had a long history as friends with Justin, but their bond would take a dark turn. The night before the murder, the two young men tried to execute their plan, but found that Justin was home. Fearing the situation would unravel, they decided to abort the mission, only to return the next day with an even more sinister intention. They would murder Justin and stage the scene to make it look as though he had stolen the safe and fled. Next day, Meyers and Mosley returned to Justin's house. Justin, trusting them as friends, let them inside. Once in the home, the violence unfolded rapidly. Without warning, Austin Meyers and Timothy Mosley attacked Justin, stabbing him over 100 times. The brutality of the attack was shocking, but the horror did not end there. Meyers, intent on ensuring the victim was dead, instructed Mosley to retrieve a gun. When Mosley returned, Meyers shot Justin's body twice in an attempt to further ensure his death. However, the gun malfunctioned on the third shot, jamming, and the casing was ejected, later found by the police and used as crucial evidence. After the murder, they attempted to dispose of the body by hiding it, and then cracked open the safe, expecting to find a fortune. To their dismay, they found $70. There was no wealth to be gained, only the gruesome aftermath of their brutal actions. The following day, Austin Meyers was arrested, and in a desperate attempt to shift blame, he tried to claim that Timothy Mosley was the one who had committed the murder. However, Mosley also denied this, and both men's involvement in the crime was clear. Austin Meyers was convicted of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and other charges related to the crime. On October 16, 2014, he was sentenced to death, making him one of Ohio's youngest inmates on death row. In 2016, the Ohio Supreme Court issued a ruling that required a unanimous jury vote in death penalty cases. Austin Meyers' original sentence had been based on a 10-2 jury recommendation, prompting the need for resentencing. In April 2023, after a lengthy legal process, Meyers was resentenced to death after a new jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. During his resentencing, Meyers' defense team argued that his troubled upbringing and mental health issues should be considered mitigating factors. They asked the jury to recommend life without the possibility of parole, citing his young age and history of emotional and family issues. Despite these arguments, the jury found the evidence of premeditation, the extreme brutality of the murder, and Meyers' lack of remorse to be overwhelming. As of 2023, Austin Meyers remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution.